Breaking news tonight. Shot. The White House is in chaos as staff members have initiated an unprecedented lockdown of entire floors, sealing off access amid reports that former President Donald Trump has lost control in an explosive internal emergency. This isn't a drill or a routine security measure. It's a desperate response to what insiders are describing as a meltdown of epic proportions. Just hours ago, in the heart of Washington, D.C., alarms blared through the iconic building as aides and security personnel scrambled to contain the situation. The target, Trump himself, who was reportedly on site for a high-stakes meeting with loyalists and advisors, triggered by a bombshell court ruling earlier this morning from the Supreme Court, denying his latest appeal in a sprawling legal battle over classified documents and election interference charges. The decision was made behind closed doors in an emergency session called by senior staff. The ruling, which upheld a lower court's order for immediate compliance and potential contempt charges, sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Timeline. This unfolded minutes ago with the lockdown order issued at approximately 11:45 p.m. Eastern Time, catching even the Secret Service off guard. Eyewitness accounts from anonymous sources inside paint a picture of pandemonium. Raised voices echoing through the halls, documents being hastily shredded, and Trump allegedly raging against the walls, demanding overrides that no one could provide. The White House press corps was evacuated under pretext of a technical issue, but leaks are already flooding social media with hashtags like "How Trump Meltdown" trending worldwide. This action by the staff isn't just procedural, it's a clear signal that the guardrails are failing. As the lockdown persists, floors housing sensitive operations, including the Situation Room and executive offices, remain inaccessible with armed personnel stationed at elevators and stairwells. The immediate catalyst was Trump's refusal to acknowledge the court's directive, reportedly shouting orders to fight back and mobilize supporters, which alarmed staff enough to invoke internal emergency protocols designed for threats to national security. In a stunning twist, this isn't coming from external forces, but from within the very apparatus that once shielded him. The decision to lock down was unanimous among the on-duty team, made in a late-night meeting where fears of escalation to violence or unauthorized actions prompted the move. As we speak, reinforcements from federal agencies are en route, underscoring the gravity. This breaking event marks a pivotal fracture in the ongoing saga of Trump's post-presidency battles, where legal entanglements have now spilled into physical containment. Stay tuned as we unpack what this means for the nation. This is not routine procedure. Far from it. In the annals of American political history, a White House staff-initiated lockdown against a former president on its premises only happens when confidence in leadership collapses entirely, signaling a shift from protection to enforcement. Institutional behavior now indicates a complete loss of patience with preparations for force, if necessary, to prevent further destabilization. What we're seeing is the machinery of government turning inward, treating Trump not as a VIP but as a potential liability. This only occurs when control slips beyond recovery, as evidenced by the rapid deployment of barriers and communication blackouts. Adding fuel to the fire is the betrayal unfolding in real time. Former allies and GOP insiders are no longer defending Trump, their silence deafening from key names like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and House Speaker Mike Johnson. Party leaders once vocal in their support are hedging bets with cautious statements about respecting the rule of law, a stark pivot from unwavering loyalty. Insiders report private reactions as pure panic, with aides distancing themselves through leaked memos and quiet exits from advisory roles. Public loyalty has been replaced by damage control, with committees like the Republican National Committee issuing neutral memos urging calm rather than rallying cries. The political meaning is crystal clear. They see what's coming, a cascade of consequences that could dismantle the MAGA apparatus. Even longtime confidants such as Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon have gone radio silent on social media, refusing to comment despite direct queries from reporters. This turning point reveals fractures in the Republican ranks where self-preservation now trumps allegiance. As the lockdown holds, whispers from Capitol Hill suggest a Senate mutiny, brewing with GOP senators privately discussing contingency plans to isolate Trump further. The betrayal stings deepest from those who rode his coattails to power, now viewing him as a sinking ship. This shift isn't subtle, it's a calculated retreat with donors pulling funds and endorsements evaporating overnight. In the broader context, this unprecedented signal from the White House staff invoking lockdown protocols, typically reserved for active threats, underscores a belief that Trump's actions pose an imminent risk to stability. The move has activated interagency alerts with the FBI and Department of Justice on high alert for any attempts to circumvent the court order. As tensions simmer, the narrative has evolved from political theater to a genuine crisis of authority, where betrayal from within accelerates the downfall. The air in D.C. is thick with anticipation, as what began as a legal setback morphs into a full-blown anarchy on the Hill. This action activates a chain of enforcement mechanisms that were once considered unthinkable in this context. With the Supreme Court's denial of the emergency stay now final, the contempt proceedings against Trump are no longer hypothetical. They are procedurally required. The lower court judge, already on record expressing frustration with repeated delays, has the green light to issue fines, asset freezes, or even an arrest warrant if noncompliance persists beyond the 48-hour window outlined in today's ruling. Possible outcomes now include seizure of remaining classified materials still under dispute, immediate referral to federal marshals for transport if Trump refuses to appear, and a formal removal process from any lingering security clearances or advisory roles tied to government contracts. One move now forces the next through legal obligation and automatic triggers. Failure to produce documents by dawn tomorrow automatically escalates to a nationwide warrant, pulling in U.S. Marshal Service assets already positioned in the D.C. metro area. Behind closed doors, the coordination is chillingly efficient. Institutions are acting in near-perfect silence and speed, suggesting a shared belief that resistance is weakening and that any further defiance could spiral into open confrontation. Strategy phase has clearly shifted to containment and isolation, with White House staff, many of whom served under multiple administrations, treating the current occupant of the visitor suite as the primary threat vector. Their objective appears twofold: control the narrative by limiting Trump's access to unsecured phones and external communications, and prevent escape, literal or figurative, by keeping him physically contained until federal authorities can assume custody if ordered. Sources with knowledge of the internal emergency playbook describe the lockdown as Phase 3 activation reserved for scenarios where executive branch personnel believe an individual is attempting to subvert lawful process from within federal property. The decision to seal floors wasn't impulsive. It followed a rapid assessment that Trump's shouted directives to aides, including demands to contact sympathetic military figures or rally crowds outside, crossed into territory that triggered mandatory reporting to the Attorney General's emergency line. This suggests not just panic, but a calculated judgment that the former president's influence, once a political asset, has become a clear and present danger to institutional integrity. In the dimly lit command post now operating on restricted floors, senior officials are quietly drafting statements for release once containment is assured, emphasizing that the measures protect both the building and the constitutional order. The speed of this response from court ruling to full lockdown in under 6 hours indicates pre-existing contingency planning, likely updated after prior legal setbacks. What emerges is a portrait of a government apparatus that has quietly prepared for this exact moment, moving with the precision of a machine that no longer trusts its former operator. Expect the next few hours to be defined by public defiance statements, emergency filings, and counter orders that could push the crisis toward open rupture. Trump is already attempting to break through the communication blackout, reportedly using smuggled devices to post fragmented messages on Truth Social, accusing staff of treason and calling for immediate mobilization of supporters to surround the White House perimeter. Those posts, though delayed and heavily moderated by platform algorithms, are being amplified by loyal influencers who describe the lockdown as a deep state coup in progress. Emergency filings are flooding the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, with Trump's legal team submitting a last-ditch motion for injunctive relief, claiming the staff action violates separation of powers and amounts to unlawful detention of a former president. Counter-orders are being drafted by sympathetic lawmakers, including draft resolutions from House Freedom Caucus members demanding an immediate congressional investigation into the White House staff's mutiny. Meanwhile, global reactions are beginning to pour in. European capitals have issued cautious statements urging respect for American judicial independence, while state-run media in Russia and China are already framing the events as proof of terminal U.S. decline. The power struggle has decisively shifted from politics to enforcement, from rhetoric to mechanism, from loyalty to raw survival. What once played out on cable news panels and campaign rallies is now governed by court clerks, federal agents, and security perimeters. Trump's inner circle is fracturing further. Several longtime advisors have been observed leaving the building under escort, refusing comment as they pass the press gaggle, still stationed blocks away behind barricades. Supporters attempting to gather near Lafayette Square are being met with rapidly expanding police lines, a sign that D.C. authorities anticipate crowd escalation. Inside the lockdown zone, the atmosphere is described as tense but controlled, with staff rotating in short shifts to maintain vigilance. The escalation phase carries real risk of miscalculation. A single unauthorized attempt to force entry or a rash public statement from Trump could trigger the deployment of additional federal resources, turning a contained emergency into a televised spectacle of constitutional crisis. Markets are already reacting. Futures on major indices are sliding as traders price in uncertainty around executive branch stability. The narrow window for de-escalation is closing fast, with every passing minute tightening the legal noose and widening the political chasm. What began as a courtroom defeat has metastasized into a live test of whether institutional mechanisms can still constrain a figure who once commanded them. International institutions are now watching with bated breath as the drama inside the White House unfolds in real time. NATO headquarters in Brussels called an unscheduled virtual emergency consultation shortly after midnight Eastern Time, with defense ministers from key member states expressing grave concern over the potential erosion of American command and control reliability. Senior diplomats described the lockdown not merely as a domestic political spectacle, but as a possible precursor to instability that could ripple across transatlantic security commitments. One European ambassador, speaking on Deep Background, noted that when the world's most powerful military has its former commander-in-chief physically contained by his own staff, every assumption about U.S. predictability is called into question. Similar unease is spreading through the United Nations Security Council corridors, where delegates from France, the United Kingdom, and even traditionally non-aligned states have privately circulated talking points emphasizing the need for Washington to demonstrate that its constitutional mechanisms remain functional. China's state media, meanwhile, has wasted no time. Xinhua and CGTN are running continuous loops of archival footage from January 6th juxtaposed with live shots of the cordoned White House perimeter, framing the event as irrefutable evidence of terminal decline in American democracy. Russian outlets are echoing the narrative, with RT and Sputnik commentators gleefully predicting that the crisis will accelerate the shift toward a multipolar world order. In the Middle East, Israeli officials are quietly reviewing contingency plans for U.S. military support in the region, while Saudi and Emirati contacts have reached out to multiple congressional offices seeking reassurance that policy continuity will not be disrupted. The financial world is reacting with visceral speed. As soon as the first credible reports of the lockdown hit trading desks, Dow Jones futures plunged more than 850 points in the thin overnight session. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq composites followed suit, wiping out roughly 2.1% of market capitalization in minutes. Currency traders moved aggressively against the US dollar. The euro climbed past 1.14. The yen strengthened to levels not seen since early 2024, and emerging market currencies already under pressure suffered sharp sell-offs. Hedge funds with heavy exposure to U.S. equities began liquidating positions, while algorithmic systems triggered stop-loss cascades that amplified the volatility. Goldman Sachs issued an after-hours client note titled U.S. Governance Risk Premium, warning that sustained uncertainty around executive branch functionality could add 50 to 75 basis points to long-term Treasury yields and shave up to 1.2 to 2% off projected GDP growth for the current quarter. Commodity markets were not spared. Crude oil futures slid below $68 a barrel on fears that political paralysis might weaken enforcement of sanctions regimes, while gold surged past $2,700 an ounce as a classic flight to safety play. Cryptocurrency exchanges saw Bitcoin drop nearly 9% before partial recovery, illustrating once again how quickly macro-political shocks transmit into digital asset classes. Credibility damage to core American institutions is already measurable and profound. The U.S. legal system, long regarded as a global gold standard for judicial independence, now faces accusations from both domestic populists and foreign critics of selective enforcement or, conversely, weaponization against political figures. Trust surveys conducted in real time by polling firms show a sharp dip in public confidence in the federal judiciary, particularly among independent voters who had previously viewed the courts as a stabilizing force. Executive authority itself appears diminished in the eyes of both allies and adversaries. The image of a former president confined by his own former employees undercuts the aura of unchallenged power that once defined the Oval Office. This symbolic fracture carries concrete diplomatic costs. Several bilateral trade negotiations, including critical semiconductor supply chain agreements with Taiwan and South Korea, have been quietly paused pending clarity on who exactly speaks for U.S. policy in the coming days. Intelligence sharing channels with Five Eyes partners are reportedly operating at reduced bandwidth as liaison officers await formal assurances that decision-making lines remain intact. The risk of diplomatic isolation is no longer theoretical. The United Kingdom's Foreign Office released a carefully worded statement at 1:17 a.m. London time, calling for swift and transparent resolution in accordance with American constitutional norms, a phrase widely interpreted as polite but unmistakable concern. Germany's chancellor posted a single-sentence tweet in both German and English: "Democracy requires institutions to function even under stress." France, traditionally more direct, had its ambassador to Washington deliver a démarche to the State Department, expressing hope that the situation would not impair the ability of the United States to meet its alliance obligations. In Asia, Japan's chief cabinet secretary convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council, while Australia's prime minister publicly reiterated Canberra's unwavering commitment to the ANZUS Treaty, language that subtly underscores anxiety about American reliability. Even India, usually cautious in its commentary on U.S. internal affairs, saw its External Affairs Ministry issue a rare on-the-record observation that stability in Washington remains essential for global security architecture. Taken together, these statements form a chorus of allied unease not heard at this pitch since the final days of the Nixon presidency. Security repositioning is already visible on multiple fronts. The Pentagon placed selected combatant commands on heightened alert status, though officials insist the move is precautionary rather than reactive. U.S. European Command reportedly increased surveillance flights over the Baltic region, while Indo-Pacific Command quietly repositioned a carrier strike group closer to the Taiwan Strait. At domestic military installations, base commanders received updated force protection guidance, emphasizing vigilance against domestic unrest spillover. The Department of Homeland Security activated regional fusion centers in the National Capital Region, coordinating with D.C. Metro Police and Virginia and Maryland state authorities to monitor potential large-scale demonstrations. Satellite imagery analysts noted increased activity at Joint Base Andrews, including the movement of additional C-32 aircraft, the military version of the Boeing 757 often used for VIP transport, suggesting preparations for possible high-level evacuations or detainee transfers if the situation deteriorates further. This is no longer a story confined to one individual or even one political faction. It has become a live, high-stakes examination of whether the American constitutional order possesses sufficient resilience to constrain a charismatic figure who once wielded and still commands extraordinary personal loyalty. The lockdown of White House floors is not merely a security tactic, it is a physical manifestation of the moment when institutional self-preservation overrode personal allegiance. Outcomes now narrow to three stark pathways: methodical enforcement through the accumulated weight of judicial and law enforcement mechanisms, a cascading collapse of the political infrastructure that elevated and protected that individual, or an unprecedented historic confrontation that forces every branch of government and perhaps the public itself into choosing sides in real time. After this moment, nothing returns to normal. The precedent has been set. A former president can be physically isolated within the very building that symbolizes ultimate executive power. The psychological barrier has been breached, and future occupants of high office, regardless of party, will operate under the shadow of that reality. Trust among political elites has fractured irreparably. Donors, operatives, and elected officials who once calculated risk through the lens of loyalty now recalibrate through the lens of legal exposure and personal liability. The national conversation, already polarized, will harden further as each side claims vindication or conspiracy, depending on the final disposition of the crisis. The situation is now irreversible, accelerating toward resolution at a pace few anticipated even 12 hours ago. Dawn is breaking over Washington, yet the capital remains shrouded in an unnatural quiet, punctuated by the low hum of generators, the crackle of police radios, and the distant murmur of growing crowds held back by steel barriers. Inside the lockdown executive residence, time has slowed to the rhythm of shift changes and whispered briefings. Outside, the world watches, waits, and recalibrates its expectations of American power. Whatever emerges when the doors finally reopen, whether orderly handover to federal authorities, defiant statements, or something far more chaotic, the republic that wakes tomorrow will not be the same one that went to sleep last night. The test is no longer abstract. It is here, it is now, and it is being decided floor by sealed floor in the most recognizable building on Earth.